Good afternoon. Today is September 5th, and this is episode 5 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I wanted to stay on the topic of pandemics. It's something that's impacting all of our lives these days, and especially asymptomatic carriers. Now, that word has come into a common parlance with the coronavirus outbreak. An asymptomatic carrier is, of course, someone who has the disease or the virus and can spread it to others even though they're not showing symptoms. Now, I don't want to get into the controversy of asymptomatic shedding or the science behind it, what controversy there may be. Instead, I want to talk about a historical example that you may or may not have heard of, or maybe you have and you didn't know what it was. And that is Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary's name is actually Mary Mallon. She was born in Northern Ireland before there was a Northern Ireland, and she migrated to New York at the early part of the 20th century. Mallon was trained as a cook back in Ireland, and she actually worked as a cook in New York, all over the place, but mostly for wealthy families. Now, being a cook paid better than any other job you could get in the house, better than being a laundress or a maid, and so Mallon wanted to remain a cook for the good pay. However, Mallon was likely born with typhoid. It's likely that her mother had contracted it during pregnancy and passed it on to the fetus, but from birth she never showed symptoms of typhoid, or typhoid fever, as it's also known. And we have no records of what happened back in Ireland, but it's entirely likely that wherever Mary Mallon went, someone came down with typhoid. And when she learned to cook and started cooking for others, it's likely people came down with typhoid. Now, the preparation of food is kind of complex. If any of you have tried to cook, you know what I mean. I am an all right cook, but I don't do things that are too complicated. But essentially, if Mary was preparing something that would be heated afterward, then it's likely that the heat would kill the typhoid virus. But whenever she would prepare something that would go directly to a consumer, there's a chance that she would pass on that typhoid virus to them. And for years, she moved around from house to house, working as a cook in the New York high society area. That's, north of the park or east-west of the park, out on Long Island. And essentially, although we don't have great details of these early years, wherever she would go, a group of people, other staff, or the family themselves, would come down with typhoid fever, and then she would move on to somewhere new. And of course, this is the early part of the 20th century, so records are very sparse, and it was so hard to track someone. But after a wealthy man named Charles Warren lost his daughter to typhoid, he wanted someone to get to the bottom of it. So he hired investigator George Soper to figure out how his children had come down with typhoid. And George did a very thorough investigation, going into all of the staff and then tracing the staff back to places they had worked previously. And what he found was, in 8 houses where the family cook had worked, 7 of them had cases of typhoid. Now, he knew that Mary Mallon was the cook, and he had a rough kind of description of this person, but he hadn't met her himself. So he spent a great deal of time going around to Long Island and other houses in New York and asking about a cook that matched his description and asking if anyone came down ill. And almost everywhere that he found the former, he also found the latter. Then he heard that there was an outbreak amongst a house on Park Avenue, and going there, he found and confronted Mary Mallon about her making everyone sick. Now, no one likes to be confronted in that manner, of course. No one wants to be blamed because everyone's getting sick. And Mallon actually confronted him with a carving knife and threatened him. A little while later, after tempers had calmed down, Soper agreed to meet her at some neutral ground, a friend of hers' apartment, and he and a doctor went and begged her for some samples so they could test this theory. But she refused. She said she wasn't sick and that typhoid was everywhere, which is true. Contaminated water in New York of the day meant that typhoid was kind of running rampant around the city. But these wealthy families had the ability to get better water, and it wasn't generally moving amongst that community. After Mallon moved yet again, and yet another family came down with typhoid, Soper had all the evidence that he needed, and he presented it to the New York State Health Department. And having identified an asymptomatic carrier who was able to infect anyone around her, they took drastic measures. They stuck Mary in quarantine. In 1907, she was sent to North Brother Island, where she was given a house and a stipend and allowed to live. And she stayed there. Not for 3 weeks, not for 6 weeks, the way that we've been quarantined here in the U.S. She stayed there until 1910. 3 years in quarantine. Now, this wasn't just by the order of the health department, but that's because Mary Mallon refused to give samples, to help participate, and to help doctors explain how it is she was making other people sick. But finally, in 1910, she agreed she would change her career and no longer work as a cook. After agreeing to give up that career and to take precautions for those around her, they released her back into the general population. For 5 years, she was freely walking and working in New York City. She tried for a while to work as a maid or as a laundress, but it paid significantly less than what she was used to. And then she got injured and was unable to work for about 6 months. To make up for that lost income and to help her survive, she went back to the thing she knew best, cooking. And with her return to cooking, so returned cases of typhoid. But Mary had gotten smarter this time. She moved around frequently, she used fake names, especially surnames, and made it very difficult for Soper to track her again. And then Mary Mallon made a mistake. She got a job at a state hospital, and after a few weeks there, 25 patients came down with typhoid, and 2 of them died. These were 2 of the 3 confirmed but likely 50 deaths that Mary Mallon was responsible for. The head doctor at the hospital called in Soper, a worker at the health department, to investigate, and he identified Mary Mallon from the descriptions of the other employees. She fled from police, but when she went to visit a friend on Long Island, she was captured. And she was returned to quarantine on North Brother Island, this time for good. From 1915 until 1938, she lived in a 1-story cottage on North Brother Island, relatively alone. For a few years, the doctor came out there to do some studies on the other patients, as well as Mary, who had been quarantined there, and Mary took a job cleaning beakers and doing general laboratory work. But for the most part, she was alone on the island with other sick people. In 1932, she had a stroke, and she never fully recovered. She remained paralyzed on half of her body, and 6 years later, in 1938, she died of pneumonia, and her body was cremated to avoid any infection from coming in contact with her corpse. There is some debate about whether or not there was an autopsy. Some stories show that there was an autopsy, and they found live infection in her gallbladder, and this was likely why no treatments other than the removal of the gallbladder would have stopped her from infecting others. And that was a very dangerous surgery at the time. And so we have the legacy of Typhoid Mary, which you probably have heard before. It just means somebody who doesn't take the proper precautions and goes about infecting others, whether they do so knowingly or not. But Typhoid Mary was a real person, Mary Mallon, and she did go around infecting others, purposefully or not. And hopefully this is a great example of what not to do while we're dealing with a pandemic here in 2020. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Rob Explains. Make sure you're following us on social media at Rob Explains. If you have a comment, a question, or a subject that you'd like me to cover, or maybe I got something wrong in a previous episode, let me know. Rob at robexplaineseverything.com, or leave a comment down below and I'll be sure to respond after the show. We've got some exciting topics coming up, and remember, brand new episodes every single day. Make sure you subscribe so those get sent directly to your device so you can enjoy them as soon as they're available. Thanks once again for joining me, and I'll look forward to speaking to you again tomorrow. But until then, take care of yourselves and each other. Have a great day.